Adam and Eve, Eve could have done that. She went from this perfect place to being absolutely just outcast and left alone. But what happened? Look at Genesis chapter 4. God had told them that the whole main, when he made him, he said, go out, reproduce. I want you to fill the earth. And it says in verse 1, it said that the man had relationships with Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I have gotten the man-child with the help of the Lord. Number one, I want to point this out to you. Do you guys know what the word Cain means? This is amazing. The word Cain, it means, and I want to make sure I got this right, I got one, or I got it. That's what it means. And the bad thing is if you look, and in the New American Standard, I like it when Bibles will admit when they add little things to try to make it readable. Well, when it says, I have gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord, that's not the literal interpretation. The literal interpretation says, I have gotten the man, the Lord. And this is where it gets kind of weird. The word the Lord is actually the tetragrammaton, the Hebrew word for God. You see, they were looking for the one. Who was the one? Go back into Genesis chapter 3. Read verse 15. He's talking about the devil. He says, I will put an enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. And he, her seed, shall bruise his head, or crush his head. I like how the little translates crush his head. And he shall bruise him on the heel. So the woman knew that the way the devil was going to be defeated, the destruction of the devil, the one who brought this all about, was going to come about from her seed. That a child that was going to be born was going to bring about the destruction of this evil kingdom that the devil's brought on the earth. And so when Cain was born, her firstborn son, she said, I got him. Here he is. Here's the one that the Lord promised. I got it. She never stopped dreaming. Even though everything, in all instances, she should have just gave up. She should have said, oh, we messed up. There's no way this can. No, she held on to that promise. And now it even gets a little more amazing. Do you know what Abel means? The next kid she had was Abel. Abel means vanity or just fruitless. Like it didn't mean anything. Empty. It was like, well, I already have the one. This other one doesn't mean anything. That's kind of the way she was looking at the kid. That's how much she just absolutely hoped and dreamed this was the one. And then what happens? He ends up becoming a murderer and ends up being cast out. Becomes a wanderer on the earth. And then it says the next kid she has is Seth. Then it says, and let's go down to chapter 4, verse 25. So Cain kills Abel, totally just crushes her hopes and dreams of this is the one that's supposed to come and save us. I don't think so. And something amazing about this. Did you notice when you read the story that God made a covenant with Cain, the murderer, the one who went and killed somebody just out of jealousy and said, I will make sure that people don't kill you? That's pretty amazing. That's some grace right there. That God loved and cared so much for Adam's kids that even when they did something horrible, God was still with them to take care of them. There's something to take home with you. So anyways, what happens here? Cain takes off. He becomes a wanderer in verse 25. So Adam had relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth. For she said, God has appointed me another seed in place of Abel, for Cain had killed him. Now see, and like I said, you got to go back into the original language here, and I have the little breakdown here. The word Seth means another seed. It means another one, another seed. And the thing is that now Cain was gone. Well, maybe this is the one. Here's another seed. Here's the seed. God, this is the one. She never stopped dreaming. And that's what I think was so amazing about Eve. She kept hope alive. She never stopped dreaming about it. It was something she fed. It was something she thought about. The other thing that's interesting about this, do you notice who's naming the kids? It's not Adam. You notice that really in Hebrew culture, if you read through the Old Testament, it was the father that named the children. It wasn't the mother. Women didn't have that kind of right to come up with names. No, it was the father that did it. So, but wait, you see here Eve. Eve's naming the kids. Why? Because she has this dream. She sees this is the one that's going to crush the head of Satan. It's funny. Now, I'm not trying to kind of break up men and women here, but I'm going to tell you something that's different about women that's men. You notice that everybody has that praying grandma that always hoped that they were going to someday become Christians. There's always that woman that never gave up, that would pray and pray and pray and never give up for someone. Women have this thing to where they can just hold on to this promise and not give up. It's sad because men have become so realistic. We've become so just cynical and practical that we kind of, forget that there are things beyond what, our nose, beyond what we can fix ourselves. We kind of have this idea, well, if I can't fix it, it can't be done. That's kind of how guys think. Women can see, hey, well, there are things out there that can do this, that it's that reaching beyond. Eve was reaching beyond her hopes that were crushed. She kept feeding that hope. She kept feeding that dream that the seed was going to come. That's amazing. That's amazing when you look at it that way. Try to put yourself in Eve's situation. Getting kicked out of the garden, seeing her firstborn son murder their secondborn son, having all this stuff going on, and she still didn't stop believing that the seed was coming. The promise that God spoke to her was alive because she kept it alive. And I'm going to say that again because it's worth repeating. The promise that God spoke to her kept alive to her because she kept it alive. For no other reason. The bottom line of it is there are things that God has spoken to us. There are things that God has spoken to us, that He's told us, that He has promised us, that will die if we don't feed it. You notice, I love how He uses the word seed. What is a seed? A seed is something you have to plant in the ground. You have to water, or it will die. If I just take a seed and throw it outside, it's not going to grow. It takes somebody to plant it. It takes somebody to water it. It takes something that you have to do, or it'll die. God promised a seed. And you go through the Old Testament, you read all the different things. The seed was the Messiah, it was Jesus. That was the promise. The promise was Jesus, that Jesus would come, born of a virgin, the seed of a woman, that would come and crush the head of the devil once and for all. And yeah, He did come, but it took time. It took watering, it took planting, it took care and nurture. It took God dealing with all these different people to finally bring about the promise. But people believed the promise all through the Old Testament. They were always reaching out for that. They were always, even when we read Jeremiah, when we read that scripture in Jeremiah, that's an Old Testament scripture. I told you about it, I think a few weeks ago, about, they were captives, they were exiles in Babylon. Go ahead and turn back to Jeremiah here. I'm going to finish up with this. They were captives in Babylon. They were in exile. They were sent out from their land. They longed to be back in Jerusalem. They longed to be back in their hometown, but they were exiles. And they never gave up hope. They never gave up hoping. And Jeremiah sent them this letter, and I love how it says it in the first part here in Jeremiah, the scripture we read here in 29. But the first verse there, in the first verse in 29, because we read verse 11, but go to the first verse. It says, "Now these are the words of the letter which Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem to the rest of the elders of the exile, the priests and the prophets, and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." He was speaking to people who had suffered. He was speaking to people who suffered for their own fault. They did wrong. They turned away from God. They didn't do what God told them to do. But God still said, I still have a future for you. I still have dreams for you and hopes. God said this. There is a future and there's a hope. God's dream for them was to have a future and a hope. And the thing is, they never lost hope.